Could the United States Army be destined for a war against Russia? It's hard to even imagine. I'm saying that, and it's not just some hyperbole or some just crazy statement, but it's becoming more and more real, something that has to be given a legitimate shot. It shouldn't happen this way. There should be even no consideration of this, but the facts on the ground are requiring it. Earlier today, there was an article in the Telegraph, which was titled "NATO Land Corridor Could Rush U.S. Troops to Frontline in Event of European War with Russia." Now, listen, that is just a crazy thing to think of, that the U.S. military, the U.S. Army in particular, could fight the Russian army in this current environment here. Now, of course, the bigger threat is, and the more troubling threat is if there was a nuclear confrontation between the two sides. But let's look at the situation, what might happen if what's depicted in this Telegraph article were to come into vogue and to happen, and the U.S. Army would go in there. Now, I've fought in several deployments in my time, to include large-scale tank-on-tank warfare in the past. And one of my commanders at that time was then Major Doug Macgregor, who's now retired colonel, of course. You know him very well. He's been on our show many times. That guy literally wrote the book on how to do future war, how the modern wars can fight based on things that had happened in the past and the capabilities, how to project these things out. So I wanted to bring him in to talk about this, because there's nobody better. I promise you. And he was not available today to come on camera, but he was able to come on the telephone. So I had him on earlier today on a recording so that we can bring it to you live right now. And I'm telling you, this is something you need to pay a lot of attention to. I always want to bring you quality programming here, but this thing here with Doug, is he brings up some incredibly salient points. And the bottom line, that as you're about to hear, is that the United States Army is nowhere near as capable as to what people think it is. And our policymakers, especially the president in Washington, needs to pay a lot of attention to this, because if he even has any fantasies about engaging in a land warfare against Russia, he needs to rethink. And here's the reason why. I'm going to talk specifically about some things. And Doug, actually, I'm going to read a part here from your book, Margin of Victory, because I think that it's very, very much appropriate for what we're going to discuss today. And if I can just bring this up, there it is right here. You wrote that each chapter of this book is going to be a clarion call to recognize that wars are decided in the decades before they begin, not by the sudden appearance of a new technological silver bullet or presence of a few strong personalities in the senior ranks during a senior battle. How effectively national, political, and military leaders adjust the framework of organization, technology, and human capital to relentless change in society, technology, and world affairs determines whether the nation state prevails or perishes in defeat. So if that be true, if basically what you were doing in the decade before the battle is what's going to determine how you do in the battle, the question is going to be, what is the United States Army going to do if it goes into a full-scale war with Russia right now? And just to kind of set the stage, there's news out that NATO is looking at how it would rush large numbers of American troops if we got into a ground war with Russia. And for the purpose of this conversation, we're going to say that it doesn't go nuclear. If it just stays conventional, I want to look at what might happen with that. Nukes is a very possibility, and that can go elsewhere. But I want to discuss, first of all, what could the U.S. Army do? And first of all, I want to ask you, over the past decade, let's just look at the premise of your book. If we look back the past decade, going back to 2014, the U.S. military primarily has had experience in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, in Somalia, several places like that, all small-scale stuff. So if that's what we have prepared up to this point, what kind of army do we have right now if we had to fight a large-scale army?
Well, first, we have a very small army. We're down to less than about 450,000. We're in no position to fight a land war in Eastern Europe, which has a front of hundreds of miles and a depth of 1,000 miles at least. The infrastructure in the theater is not developed beyond Germany. There's surprisingly little in Poland. So the point is, I can't imagine the use of the United States Army to do much more than potentially defend. And you're talking about offensive operations because you have to move into Eastern Europe. Now, having said that, remember that the vast majority of the equipment that the Army is using and the organization that we see on the battlefield today was developed in the 70s and the 80s for use in the 90s. And we're now in the year 2024. We're talking about a very different mix of technologies, different organizational constructs. The Russians have adapted. They've had to adapt because they were thrust into a war for which they too were really not prepared. You'll recall when the Russians first went into Ukraine, their force was too small, wasn't really organized to deal with the robust Ukrainian army. All of that has changed. So on the tactical level, we're an anachronism. We're not really prepared. We don't have sufficient air defense and missile defense capabilities, which would mean that we're naked in the face of the enemy. In other words, the Russians. Now, having said that, the RUSI in London just published a report saying that the combined air defenses in Western Europe could protect at most 5% of the infrastructure.
Yeah, I just saw that actually.
Which puts us in a very difficult position. Now, let's start at the top. Strategically, we're operating on the opponent's doorstep, where the opponent has every advantage logistically, in terms of range, weapons, ammunition, resupply, and so forth. We're at the end right now in Poland on the border with Ukraine of our logistical support structure. Now you want to move this Lilliputian force, frankly, into an area where it'll face probably 800,000 Russian troops. You have the same thing with the Europeans. The worst part is that our force has very little unity of command, which means no unity of effort. Why? Because we're dealing with multiple foreign contingents. The Russians have one language of command, Russian. They have one uniform command and control structure, and they have both operational as well as strategic ISR. Our strategic ISR in space is very formidable. We do have operational ISR from the fleet as well as the shore, but it's very vulnerable to attack. The one area where we do have an advantage is air power. We outnumber the numbers of Russian aircraft that could be hurled against us by 5, 6, 7 times. However, we would have to fight our way through integrated air defenses. That would involve some losses. We have to fly from vulnerable airfields that are relatively close to the battlefront because they're short-range fighters.
And Doug, let me just as you're talking right now, I have a map on the screen that shows from the Telegraph, which was talking about there would be 5 different locations from Norway, Germany, Italy, Turkey, and the Netherlands and Italy down in the south, actually, where they would come into. It shows relatively limited or narrow constrained areas here. And in that same article, because I think this is related to exactly what you're talking about, Lieutenant General Solfrank, who's the NATO logistics chief, makes the point here, and this is something you've been really talking about for decades, frankly, is that the vulnerability of these large logistics bases and these large concentrations of troops and equipment, et cetera, that we did like in Desert Storm. We had these huge bases that were never touched. But he's saying that because of the Russia's long-range missile systems now, that's a thing of the past. But here's the big problem. All we've ever done is practice with these large-scale movements. What kind of difficulties would we have moving in these 5 directions, even try to get to the battlefront?
Well, you look at the distances that are on the map. You're talking about hundreds of kilometers. In other words, 150, 200, 300 miles, trying to operate in areas where you don't have nearly enough pre-positioned ammunition supplies, and yet we haven't even talked about medical evacuation. All of those things are a nightmare. We're simply not prepared to launch offensive operations into Eastern Europe. If you go back to 1941, very rapidly, the Germans discovered they were on a front of 1,100 miles with about anywhere from 600 to 1,000 miles deep. We're not prepared for that. We don't have the numbers. We don't have the logistical infrastructure. And as you point out, the air power has to be positioned forward. If it's forward, it's going to be vulnerable. We haven't even discussed something else which has to be mentioned. And if we've listened to the Russians over the last several weeks, repeatedly, they've said, look, if you attack us on our soil, if you launch strikes against us, we reserve the right to return the favor with tactical nuclear weapons. Now, very specifically, we're very reliant on F-15s. The F-15 is a brilliant aircraft, fighter, bomber, and the Russians know that it is capable of carrying and launching nuclear weapons. It's the same thing with B-52s. If the Russians see large numbers of F-15s headed in their direction, and we would use large numbers of aircraft because we're not going to allow our forces to go forward into Ukraine without air cover, then the Russians would feel probably compelled to immediately attack all of those airfields and airports with tactical nuclear weapons. Why bother with conventional weapons? One or two tactical nuclear weapons of 5 kiloton or less will annihilate the airfields in the space of an hour. And why would you wait around for us to attack and destroy them? So I think it's not just conventional. They definitely have the edge in conventional military power. But why risk the arrival of F-15s with nuclear weapons over your soil? I don't think the Russians would do that. I think the Russians are telling us they're ready. And remember, the Russians have a battle-hardened force. They've been fighting for several years. They've eliminated a lot of weak officers, weak commanders at every level. We have no such experience. If you go, as you mentioned earlier, Dan, if you go back over the last 30 years, when have we relieved anyone in the field for failure to perform? Well, if you're performing against opponents that have no armies, no air forces, no naval forces, the general officer is really never tested. And the troops rely excessively on firepower as opposed to maneuver. There's no agility in terms of thinking and behavior. There's no experience to base anything on. So the Russians have a decided advantage strategically, operationally, and tactically. I don't think we can overcome those.
Doug, let me ask you this question, because I remember something you told me within the first 6 or 8 weeks of the war back in early 2022. There was a lot of commentary in the Western press that was ridiculing the Russian military and saying they were a paper tiger. They were, this terrible force. They'd made so many mistakes. And I remember you said, well, we have to understand that when anybody who's going into combat for the first time, like they were at that time, because they hadn't had any kind of combat experience, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. I wonder if you can compare what you saw then with what you see now in the Russian forces. And then if you could contrast that with where we are, the U.S. military, in that same category of experience.
Well, the first thing we have to recognize is the massive expansion of logistical infrastructure in Russia, Eastern Ukraine, and Belarus. That means expansion in terms of railheads, railroads, highways, roads that are now paved that were previously unpaved, and also the concentration of transport aircraft, helicopter or rotor driven, that can pick up and move loads of equipment and people from place to place. The Russians have become very good at it, and they've invested very heavily in it. To this must be added the manufacturing base, the ability to produce large quantities of ammunition, missiles, and so forth. Now, I don't know what the current state of the Russian missile arsenal is, and they have fired large numbers of missiles. But as you recall, the argument was made repeatedly over the last 3 years, well, the Russians are running out. The Russians can't keep up, and so forth. The Russians never ran out of anything, and they have more than kept up with the requirements in the field. Where do we stand when you look at those same things? Well, the manufacturing base in Europe is very weak. We've discovered that our war stocks are largely exhausted, having shipped so much to Ukraine. We cannot keep up. We don't have the factories to produce the munitions and produce the equipment. We don't have the repair facilities. As far as moving equipment is concerned, we're dependent on a very small number of rail heads that run out of Germany and a small number of ports. And I don't see any of that improving very rapidly. In fact, those ports, like the airfields, could well come under attack and be destroyed quite quickly. So at the end of the discussion, for reasons of logistics alone, I think we're doomed. Now, then you move on to the forces itself. What kind of cohesion do we have in these various combat units? I doubt very seriously that we have any cohesion at all. We've lost large numbers of very competent officers, non-commissioned officers, and soldiers who in recent years have become disgusted with the repetition of being moved from Afghanistan to Iraq to Syria to some other place. And they don't get enough time at home. They can't live normal lives. And they became very disenchanted in many cases because they said, what are we really doing? What are we accomplishing? So we don't have many of the best soldiers that we had a few years ago. We have, frankly, weak forces. The Europeans are in just as bad a position in that sense. Now, yes, they are green. So are we. We haven't fought toe-to-toe with an enemy that's even remotely like ourselves. We haven't had to deal with large quantities of artillery, rocket artillery, or conventional artillery, airstrikes, or anything else. Those things do make a huge difference, as you know from personal experience. That's not going to be made up quickly. So I would argue that it's a very bad situation, and we could be in a position not very different from the French and British forces in 1940, who were simply unprepared for the German onslaught. Again, no one seems to have thought through any of this. We look at numbers. I mean, someone has presented numbers recently. We have more aircraft than the Russians. Well, that's true. But where are they? How are they organized? How are they going to fly? How long can we sustain them in the air? How long before we run out of repair parts, fuel, and everything else? Remember, the Germans during World War II were defeated in large measure because we destroyed the sources of their fuel and then their ability to redistribute it. How long would it take to do that to us? Remember, Europe is a relatively small area, but once you move east into Poland and Ukraine, as I pointed out, the front is enormous. You know, from the top arrow all the way down to the Black Sea is easily 1,000 miles. That's an enormous front. We're not prepared for something like that. We're not prepared for the depth. We're not talking about, a couple of 100 miles. If you go back to 1991, we moved a relatively short distance. The distance from Saudi Arabia to the Euphrates River was a little further than the distance from Washington, D.C. to Philadelphia. Now you're talking about distances from St. Louis to Washington, D.C. That's a huge difference in the way you think. It's a huge difference in the way you supply, sustain. None of this, in my judgment, has been carefully considered. I think there's an assumption that we will hit the Russians and the Russians will be so impressed and so shocked that they'll all run away or something. I have no idea what's on people's minds, but it's not going to work. We're not prepared for this. We were much better prepared, incidentally, in 1963. And remember that in 1963, the Russians had made an enormous mistake strategically. They had positioned forces in Cuba right on our doorstep.
Yeah.
They had no chance whatsoever of success against us there. We held all of the advantages that we are now imputing to the Russians in the Western Hemisphere in the United States. Aircraft, ships, troops, everything. And the other thing is we have a lot of people right now, I think particularly in the Air Force and the Navy, who are chomping at the bit to get into this business. They haven't buried any of their friends the way you and I have and the way many others have over the last 30 years. And I think they have a sort of unrealistic picture of what they're going to be up against. Again, no one is prepared for this.
Now, let me ask you something, Doug. It's conventional wisdom, and I've talked to a lot of people who, even some here in Washington D.C., who are sober-minded and are balanced. They're not just blind, but there is this underlying assumption that, okay, well, the Ukraine side, I mean, they weren't well trained. They're doing the best that they can, but it's nothing like the high level of training that the NATO side has, and especially the United States. And if Russia went up against our soldiers, it would be a whole different ballgame on the ground. What do you say to those arguments?
Well, much depends on the training we're discussing. our forces are probably trained to some extent to deal with the OPFOR at NTC, but the OPFOR at NTC bears no resemblance to the Russian armed forces today. And again, we overrate our experience over the last 30 years. You're talking about margin of victory. In the first chapter, we talk about the British Expeditionary Force that was sent to France. And that was a very good but small British army. And it was no match for the Germans, even though the British Expeditionary Force was filled with officers and soldiers with lots of experience in Africa and India and other areas of the British Empire. But they were not prepared for what the German army offered. And they were largely destroyed within the space of about 3 or 4 weeks. Destroyed to the point where they had to bring hundreds of thousands of civilians now in uniform from Great Britain just to man the lines. And at the end of the day, they could only man 20 miles of a 450-mile front. The rest of it had to be manned by the French, who had already sustained 600,000 or 700,000 casualties by that point. My argument is this: we are not prepared. We do not have the experience. We don't have time, as you pointed out at the beginning. The Russians now have much of what they lacked. Are they perfect? Are they 10 feet tall? No, but I would give them a good solid 8 feet at this point compared with ourselves. And we are certainly not 6 feet tall at this point.
So then let me ask you this on in terms of the psychological issue. I think that's one of the things that's not considered really very much at all in terms of fighting toughness. So we have, I mean, we just got to be honest, the level of training, the type of training that U.S. Armed Forces do today is not even as tough as it was back in the day when you and I were on active duty. But you see that the Russians, they have been very, very battle hardened, psychologically hardened or whatever. How would you see those factors playing, despite whatever it looks like on paper? What's it going to look like on the ground when they fight?
Well, if you look at a battlefield like Bakhmut, which was a bloodbath by any measure, primarily Ukrainian, but the Russians took a lot of casualties in Bakhmut, and they had to fight through that day after day, week after week, month after month. Many of those veterans have experienced similar battles subsequently in the Russian military. We haven't been through anything like that. We're not ready for anything like that. And I think you and I know that we were very good in 1990 and 91, but we could have been better. The discipline could have been better. I would say we were 80% of what we could be. Today, I think we're at most 40 or 50% of what we should be. The Russians are closer to 90% of what they need to be. Their discipline is tougher. And again, all the weaklings have been weeded out. The poor general officers that lack guts, lack stamina, breadth, brains, those people have been dumped. A lot of the corruption that was widespread has been eliminated. In fact, Putin just relieved 4 general officers, including 1 deputy of the general staff, for corruption. They've cracked down enormously and improved themselves. I'm not saying they're perfect. That's why I'm suggesting they're not 10 feet tall. But I give them a good 8 feet right now compared with us. And we're lucky to be 5'5". And that's not a good thing.
Sticking on that theme for a second, I want to ask one thing here about the types of battles. So one thing I've noticed through watching really how the tactical fight for the Russians has evolved from the first time they rolled in until now. And also on the Ukraine side, they seem to have devolved away from large unit operations, not even company size, certainly not battalion size, but almost like disjointed squad and platoons, and sometimes individual vehicles I've seen, because if they get bigger, they find, the drones come and get them. The artillery comes and falls on either side there. So it's kind of devolved into a disjointed or maybe a dispersed, maybe not disjointed, a dispersed but connected fight on the ground. Whereas everything we've done to the National Training Center, like you mentioned a minute ago, as far as I know, we're still doing normal company, battalion, brigade, et cetera fight. How does the mentality of the way we have fought, if it goes into this disjointed area way of fighting, how fast can we adjust to that, or can we keep fighting the way we've been doing?
Well, the Russians, for instance, have tended to utilize brigade headquarters as what we would term operational maneuver headquarters, and then rotate battalion organizations, battle groups that are very different from ours on a routine basis, 2, 3, 4 days. Battalions are rotating under the same brigade headquarters, but the battalions change. They're very acutely sensitive to people becoming exhausted, overwhelmed, traumatized
What the hell?
by the battlefield. So they now have a large number of forces that they didn't have before. Your so-called divisions, they have very few divisions, and the ones they have been treated as pools of assets from which they pull things out and send forward. And these brigade organizations, there are multiple numbers of them, and as you point out rightly, they are widely distributed. They can concentrate their fires very, very rapidly. And the Russians, of course, who've always had a preponderance of indirect fire and strike formations going back centuries, but certainly to the Second World War, they're prepared to concentrate great quantities of fire very, very quickly at any number of different locations. And then they can vector units into those areas as necessary to exploit the fire. We're not trained to do that at all. And we are not protected by the massive integrated air defenses that the Russians utilize. The Russians will not advance beyond the limits of their integrated air defenses. They've learned that if you do that, your ground force is at risk of attack from all of these unmanned systems, drones, rocket artillery, artillery strikes. So they've been very deliberate, very cautious, very careful how they do business. We have no experience with this. We don't know how to handle those things, and we don't have enough uh, tactical air defense to ensure that our armored forces survive. And we are not widely distributed. You and I served in the armored cavalry, and you remember the fights that I had trying to get us into very large zones of attack, 20 kilometers across, just for an 1,100 man cavalry squadron, armored battle group, 42 tanks, 42 Bradleys, 8 guns. And people were appalled and kept insisting this was dangerous, that somehow or another, this wide distribution of force over a large area and also in depth, because it ran back 5-6 kilometers behind the 20-kilometer front, that this was too difficult to handle, too difficult to work. Well, it worked brilliantly. It worked very well for us. We were in an open desert.
Right. I actually have our battle graphics up on the screen as you're talking, by the way, so people can actually see it.
The point is that there was resistance to it 30 years ago. There is still resistance now. People are afraid to break up concentrations for fear that they will lose control. The emphasis in the U.S. military on the ground is much more on control than it is command. And there's a huge difference, as you and I know, because command is an influence, control is restrictive. The command influence can encourage initiative. It can encourage people to understand the intent and achieve it. Control can be paralyzing. And it's been my experience that we tend to paralyze more than we do anything else. So I think this is a tragedy waiting to happen, and we should avoid it at all costs, because again, the potential for this to go nuclear is huge, and we don't want to escalate to that level. And we will end up dealing with forces at sea as well as on land and in the air that could be devastating to us, not just to the Russians, but to us in particular, and certainly to the Europeans.
Right. I know we're running low on time here, so I want to get 2 more questions in real quick. First of all, I want to go back to that comment you mentioned at the first, where it's been revealed and admitted that NATO has 5% of the air defense capabilities needed to protect Europe, especially on the eastern flank. Quick question. How long, how big of a vulnerability is that if we're talking about any kind of a ground incursion or fight between the Russians and NATO? And then, secondly, how long would it take to rectify that problem?
Well, there's no way to rectify it within the space of months. It would take years to establish an integrated air defense structure. We've never done it with overlapping radar coverage and a multitude of different air defense systems. We have cast aside the requirement for different kinds of systems with different ranges and different radars and different missiles in order to provide massive coverage over a large front for years. We simply haven't looked into it, and we have relied almost exclusively, exclusively on our air power to compensate. The problem is that our air power may be more plentiful, and it may be in technological terms better, but it cannot compensate for the weaknesses in the defensive systems to protect our logistical infrastructure, our medical infrastructure, let alone the civilian population that undoubtedly would be drawn into this, as well as the transportation infrastructure. And you and I also know how desperately thirsty for fuel the U.S. forces are with these turbine engines. And again, the turbine engines that emit a lot of heat, in addition to drinking fuel to the point where you have, quote unquote, an 8-hour tank, if you're lucky. In other words, if you keep the thing running every 7 or 8 hours, it's got to be refueled. And you cannot start that tank up and move it very quickly if you're on an auxiliary engine of some kind and then suddenly want to switch to your turbine engine. I mean, all of these things, we could go on and on, but refueling in combat in a war zone where essentially it's a 360-degree fight. Those things are not practiced. They're not understood. We haven't rehearsed them. We're not ready for it. We're not even ready for mass casualties. Yeah. And that's one of the things that the Russians learned to deal with very effectively. The Ukrainians never did. And I think many of the problems that the Ukrainians had were a function not so much of their failure to be adequately trained, but to be trained for the right thing and to be adequately supported from the very beginning on the ground. You cannot build an army from scratch in the space of a couple of years. And that's what the Ukrainians tried to do. We're now trying to throw together forces at the last minute. Someone said that we're going to have to send an additional 300,000 troops to Poland and Romania. Well, if you're going to do that, where are they going to come from?
Yeah,
you're going to have to pull for the National Guard.
Yeah, our entire force is less than 500,000 total on active duty.
So, I mean, what do how do you get those? Are we going to go through a long period of train up? No, we can't afford to do that. So now you're dumping literally tens of thousands of people in uniform who are civilians with very little notice into the laps of commanders in Poland and Romania and potentially the Baltic states and telling them, make something out of them, make it work. It's a prescription for failure. The whole idea should be immediately scrapped.
Good. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. In every way you want to measure this, it's bad. Doug, in the last few minutes you have here, I wonder if you can comment on your understanding of what may come next on the ground in the current fight here, because the Ukrainian Minister of Defense a few days back said that he revealed that in addition to this new incursion north of Kharkiv, and then, of course, all along the line of contact in the 600-mile front in the east, there's an additional up to 200,000 Russian forces that are somewhere in the north that are in an unspecific location. I saw this morning there's more and more evidence of a lot of armored vehicles being repositioned north in the Russian north of the Ukraine border in Russia. What do you think may be coming in the coming weeks, and can the Ukrainian forces withstand a new incursion somewhere?
Well, first of all, the Ukrainian forces can't withstand anything anymore. It doesn't matter where the Russians want to advance. They're finished, and large numbers of them are deserting. I wouldn't put any trust or confidence in anything happening in the Ukrainian army right now. Secondly, you're talking about something that the Russians have always had available, but have chosen not to use it, and that is the northern front coming out of Belarus. And they may have decided that it's now necessary to end this war as quickly as possible, in which case a thrust from Belarus south towards Kiev becomes necessary, because then you could also move forces from the east towards Kiev from the other side of the Dnieper River. And there are many bridges over the Dnieper that the Russians have purposely kept intact that they can use and cross. So I think Kiev itself could not end up under siege, but be attacked from the north, from the east, and from the south very rapidly. We'll know more when Zelensky and his courageous little band of friends pack cash into their aircraft or train or something and try to leave the city. I think it'll look a lot like the last days of Kabul in Ukraine, if that turns out to be the case. And again, of course, the Russians have an incentive now, given all the threats that we're making,
Right.
to rapidly move and try to end this thing. An awful lot is going to depend, frankly, near term, on what we do. And when I say we, I mean we. You know, we say the Ukrainians are launching something, but the truth is we have to operate most of these systems, and they depend entirely on our space-based surveillance, as well as operational surveillance from AWACS-style aircraft. If we strike targets deep inside Russia, then I think the Russians will regard that as a direct and unambiguous declaration of war against them by us. Then I think all bets are off. The Russians will move decisively, as discussed, on the ground, but they may also attack targets from Finland all the way to Romania. And they may decide just to go ahead and use tactical nuclear weapons to do it, because they may conclude that they're in a use it or lose it mode. I don't know. And this is the problem, Dan. Nobody knows.
Yeah.
That's why this needs to stop now. We can't contain or manage this catastrophe. We need to stop it. Stop it immediately.
Couldn't agree with you more. Listen, Doug, I know you got to go. Thank you so much for your time today. And even though this is some pretty sober stuff here, we got to know the truth, and people need to understand what we're facing, the reality, not the fiction. And we're very grateful for you to share that with us today. Thank you very much.
Sure.